From the moment Petrucciani found he could excel at the piano, what he could do overcame what he was. "I play jazz piano, baby, and I do it faster and better than anybody. I do. Therefore, it doesn't matter what I am. I don't regret being born." Michel Petrucciani was born December 28, 1962, in the south of France, with every bone in his body broken. Diagnosed with osteogenesis imperfecta, or glass bone disease. He could not walk and was not expected to live beyond the age of 20. His bones fractured constantly, but he was blessed with two things. He had immense charisma, and he was a musical prodigy. This genetic disease caused brittle bones, and in his case, a short stature. He never went to school. He stayed in his room for his whole childhood and played jazz piano for 10 hours a day under the guidance of his father, a local musician and jazz fanatic. By the age of 13, he sounded, according to one critic, like a 38-year-old world-weary black man lost in a piano bar somewhere in Mexico. He became one of the most accomplished jazz pianists of his generation, despite his health condition and relatively short life. The disease caused his bones to fracture over 100 times before he reached adolescence, and kept him in pain throughout his entire life. In certain respects, he considered his disability an advantage, as he got rid of distractions like sports that other boys tended to become involved in. And he hints that his disability was helpful in other parts of his life. He said, "Sometimes I think someone upstairs saved me from being ordinary." From the beginning, Petrucciani had always been musical, reportedly humming Wes Montgomery solos by the time he learned to speak. He began learning classical piano at the age of 4, and was making music with his family by the age of 9. The musician who would prove most influential to Petrucciani was Bill Evans, to whom he began listening to around the age of 10. Petrucciani's layered harmonies, lyrical style, and articulation of melody have always been linked most strongly to this early exposure to Evans. Petrucciani gave his first professional concert at the age of 13. At this point of his life, he was still quite fragile and had to be carried to and from the piano. His hands were average in length, but his size meant that he required aids to reach the piano's pedals. Aldo Romano, his drummer, describes himself as Petrucciani's second father and remains proud of having helped Petrucciani pull away from the first one. "He wanted to see the world," recalls Romano, "but Michel was very fragile, and so everybody in his family was afraid. And also you have the problem of his father, because his father was an idiot. He didn't trust anybody. He wanted to keep him as a partner, to play music with. He was very jealous. So I had to fight to take him to Paris, because his father didn't want me to. Because he wanted to keep him, like you would cage a monster." Petrucciani made his first trip to Paris at the age of 15. There he played with Kenny Clarke in 1977 and Clark Terry in 1978. His breakthrough performance occurred at the Cleusclat Jazz Festival. Terry was missing a pianist, and when Petrucciani was carried onto the stage, he thought it was a joke. Petrucciani was no more than 3 feet tall, but he astounded Terry and the rest of the festival with his prodigious talent and virtuosity. Terry said, "When I heard him play, oh man, he was a dwarf, but he played like a giant. I said, 'Listen, little guy, don't run away. I'll be back for you.'" After a brief visit to Paris and a return home in the autumn of 1980, Petrucciani moved into Aldo Romano's house in the western perimeter of Paris and began his life as an adult. He was free of the protective presence of his father and began enjoying an independent lifestyle. Petrucciani, who was always aware of his mortality because of his disease, worked fast. Through an introduction by Romano, Petrucciani signed a recording contract with Owl Records and recorded 6 albums within 3 years. Eventually, however, Petrucciani desired independence from Romano too. Romano remembers, "He didn't feel free with me, so he had to kill his second father somehow to move on. He needed to escape. He needed to go very far as he could go, and that was California. In California, he visited retired saxophonist Charles Lloyd. The meeting was to change his life. Stunned by his talent, Lloyd came out of retirement, and they toured together for the next 4 years. Petrucciani and Lloyd's tour of the West Coast was a huge success, and they continued internationally. On February 22, 1985, with Petrucciani cradled in his arms, Lloyd walked onto the stage at Town Hall in New York City and sat him on his piano stool for what would be a historic evening in jazz history, the filming of One Night with Blue Note. Petrucciani and Lloyd's performance at the Montreux Jazz Festival was made into an album, and in 1982 they won the 1982 Prix d'Excellence. But Petrucciani expressed mostly disdain and frustration at the awards being heaped upon him, believing that he was receiving so many, at least in part, because people believed he was going to die young. Petrucciani moved to New York City in 1984 and spent the rest of his life there. This was the most productive period of his career. He played at the Montreux Jazz Festival with Wayne Shorter and Jim Hall in 1986, producing the trio album Power of Three. He also played with diverse figures in the U.S. jazz scene, including Dizzy Gillespie. It was when he went to New York that he really found himself. In the 80s, it was a jazz mecca, and all the greats were playing there, and Petrucciani was playing with them. He signed to Blue Note Records and made albums with, among others, Wayne Shorter, Roy Haynes, and Jim Hall. And still his body broke. Even while he was playing, tendons snapped, shoulder blades fractured, fingers shattered. He just continued, seemingly oblivious to the pain. Petrucciani was immensely attractive to women, and he knew it. It wasn't good enough for him to find a woman he liked. He had to betray them. Drugs, women, food. His appetites were enormous. His desire to experience everything insatiable. He lived fast, too fast, but he wanted to taste it all. Michel Petrucciani was a pianistic genius. The power of his playing transcended his physical limitations. He was also an extrovert and ladies' man with a checkered romantic history that certainly proved that size doesn't matter. In late 1989, he met the woman who was to become the mother of his child, Alexandre, who was born with the same condition as him. Petrucciani was devastated, but at the same time, it was an affirmation, the acceptance that he craved. To refuse to accept this would be like refusing to accept myself, he said. I've never been around anyone who loved to live like Petrucciani and live life to the fullest, said Mary Ann Topper, his New York manager. He said to me, Mary Ann, I want to have at least 5 women at once. I want to make $1 million in one night, things that were probably impossible. But had Michel ever thought that anything was impossible, he would have never done anything he did. As Petrucciani himself said, I'm a brat. My philosophy is to have a really good time and never let anything stop me from doing what I want to do. In his last years, Petrucciani worked at a manic pace, performing more than 100 solo piano concerts per year, 140 in 1998 alone. Too weak to stand with crutches, he was now using a wheelchair regularly. He was working too much, not only recording and doing concerts, but he was always on television, and he was always doing interviews, recalls Bernard Yvain, Petrucciani's manager in his final years. He got himself overworked, and you could see it. He pushed too much. Late in 1998, Petrucciani decided to slow down. He couldn't keep up that pace anymore. He was physically exhausted. In January 1999, he was rushed to a hospital in New York. He didn't recover. Petrucciani died from a pulmonary infection a week after his 36th birthday. He was buried in Paris, one tomb away from Chopin. This is Alexander from One Track Jazz. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe.